Good evening, everyone. My name is Rira, and I work for Roman's Bookstore. I'd like to thank everyone for joining us for our virtual event with Katie Orphan, who is here to present her book, Read Me Los Angeles, Exploring LA's Book Culture. We're so grateful that our bookstore can continue bringing authors and their works to our community during a time of social distancing. Before I introduce Katie, I do have some announcements and some quick guidelines. Romans Live will be hosting more virtual events in the near future, and you can learn more about them on our website as well as our social media. Our next event is scheduled for tomorrow, actually, on May 28th at 6 p.m. with Joanna Hershen, who will be presenting her book, St. Ivo. For regular updates on upcoming events, please feel free to subscribe to our newsletter, as well as checking out our calendar. This evening's event will end with a Q&A. To submit a question, please use the Ask the Question button at the very bottom of the screen. If you see a question on the list that you'd like for Katie to answer, you can vote for it, and the question will make its way to the top of the list. Also, please consider supporting our bookstore by purchasing a copy of tonight's featured book. Just click the green purchase button directly below the viewer screen, and the link will redirect you to our website where you can continue your checkout process. And okay, let me introduce Katie. Katie Orphan managed the Last Bookstore located in downtown Los Angeles for a decade and is now the owner of Orphan Books Inc. Her writing can be found on LitHub and the Los Angeles Review of Books. She has also been featured in publications such as the New York Times and Open Skies magazine, as well as with Los Angeles's CBS, WB, and NBC affiliates. And I'm going to turn the camera over to Katie, so sit back and relax, everyone, and enjoy the talk. Hey.
Yay! Oh my gosh, this is so exciting and so strange that I can't see you all, so I'm just going to assume that there are people watching, and we'll proceed from there. As Rira said, my name is Katie Orphan. I am a longtime bookseller, and that for me is a big genesis of how this book came about on my end of things. So I'll start with my side of the story, and then I'll tell you the rest of it. I got a job working for the owner of the Last Bookstore before the bookstore opened. I came with a couple English degrees and time spent working at Borders and my hometown public library, and he was looking for somebody with book experience. And he hired me, and a few months later opened the store. And I really loved meeting local readers and local writers. And as the Last Bookstore got more popular with tourists, we would have people coming and asking for recommendations of Los Angeles authors. And so I gave myself the best education I could, and I started reading authors I had heard of and never read. I started reading authors I'd never heard of, but was suddenly introduced to. And, you know, also acknowledging and recognizing the authors that I had grown up with who were from Los Angeles and whom I loved. And as I was doing more of this reading, more of this recommending, more of building our section of books for Los Angeles, I was realizing how underrepresented Los Angeles was when it came to literary tourism and collections of LA-specific writing, and even recognition of Los Angeles in collections of literary tourism. Books would come out, really cool books, and they were great, and they would, you know, cover authors from all over the country or all over the world. And if they talked about Los Angeles, they talked about Raymond Chandler, and that was it. And I was like, that's great, but that's not enough. Raymond Chandler is just one of so many authors in Los Angeles. And there are authors that I think people outside of LA don't necessarily associate with Los Angeles, but within the city, like, I think it's really hard to miss the importance of Ray Bradbury. But, you know, people think about him and Mars or the unnamed city of Fahrenheit 451, and they don't think about him as a pillar of the Los Angeles literary scene. So with all of that in mind, I started thinking about trying to do a book on the topic. I was writing occasional pieces for LitHub about literary life in Los Angeles. And so I started working on a proposal. I started doing research. I spent probably 2 years roughly reading specifically with this project in mind, and just taking notes on everything I read. I have a file on my phone that's just books I read, and within each book, any geographical location that was mentioned and the page number. So I'm working on all of this. I found a great agent, Dara Hyde at Hill Nadell, and she is working on this proposal with me. And then one day, very close to the proposal being finished, I got an email in my role as the buyer at the Last Bookstore from Colleen Dunn Bates at Prospect Park Books, asking if a book like this would sell, because it turns out Colleen, who is a 6th generation Angelino, who runs one of LA's great publishing houses, who has been devoted to writing about LA, publishing LA authors. You know, her cookbooks are some of the best LA-focused cookbooks. You know, lots of other publishers are just getting into regularly publishing LA cookbooks, and Colleen has been at it this whole time. But she has also been dreaming about a book like this for quite a while. And I got her email and was like, well, I hope people want to buy a book like this because I'm trying to write one. And our plans came together and merged. And in January of last year, we signed contracts. And then by June of last year, the book was due. So in the space of about 4 months, from the end of January to the beginning of June, I wrote the book with lots of input and guidance and editing, and an incredible team of artists, photographers, layout art. I don't know what the best title is for Amy Inouye, who did the layout and design for the book. I'm about to like pick it up and show you guys some of this. And it's so beautiful. Okay, so here's the book cover itself. An artist named Kate Wong did all of the paintings for us. So you can see like Beyond Baroque and 826 and Musso's and the Huntington. She did all of that. Our photographer, Shaheen, went around LA taking pictures of all the places I wrote about. And Amy put together this incredible package with bright colors and lists and just a really vibrant layout. And it is the most wonderfully collaborative project I ever could have been a part of. And I think the project is all the richer for having done that, because we have lists throughout the book of LA authors, bookstores, noir titles, important memoirs, history books, and to be able to have such a great group of people, all of the folks who work at Prospect Park and myself putting together as many names into things as possible, really made it as good as it possibly could be. I think. I think so. I'm really happy with it. But I also am always like, oh, I wish we had enough space for this and for that. Because LA literature is so deep and rich and varied that I could really spend the rest of my life just writing about that. So keep asking questions because I'm really excited to get to those, because doing this on my own, I'm like, I don't know what people want to know about. So please submit questions and I'll answer them as best as possible. And I thought I'd maybe read you guys a little. Yeah, let's see. Okay, so since I'm doing this event with Vromans, one, I'm wearing my Vromans t-shirt. Very excited about that. And two, I'm going to read you a little bit about Octavia Butler, who is from Pasadena and is getting much more recognition now, which is wonderful and well-deserved. And I'm excited to get to see more and more about her as people continue to discover her and read her. The Huntington Library in San Marino was the logical starting place. It acquired Butler's extensive papers and key belongings after she died in 2006, and it's a rich collection that attracts scholars every year. Although there are no permanent displays of her work, alongside the Gutenberg Bible or the manuscript of Jack London's The Sea Wolf, the library put on an exhibition of her work in 2017, and I made sure to visit. Seeing her notebooks and pictures of Butler in her youth gave me background and understanding that added depth to my reading of her fiction, not to mention clues identifying locations from her life in Pasadena and Altadena to explore. Butler grew up in a sharp contrast to the wealth on display at the opulent library and vast gardens of Henry Huntington's San Marino estate. The daughter of a maid, her father died when she was a baby, she was a shy, tall, awkward African-American girl in a racially mixed North Pasadena neighborhood. She attended Pasadena public schools, graduating from John Muir High and Pasadena City College. The disparity between her work's current home at the Lux Huntington and her working class roots a few miles away calls to mind her descriptions of the fictional suburb of Robles in Parable of the Sower. Robles, 20 miles from Los Angeles, and, according to Dad, once a rich, green, unwalled little city, stands apart from her depiction of the fictional 2024 wreckage of Los Angeles, functioning as a metaphor for the socioeconomic gulf between San Marino and the poorer parts of LA. So that's a little bit about Octavia Butler. For those of you who don't yet have the book, there is a really handy little purchase Read Me Los Angeles button right there. But it is a mix of short essays about visiting locations from the novels and nonfiction I read, as well as places from the authors' lives. So I visited cemeteries. I've been to Octavia Butler's grave, and now every time I drive by her cemetery, if there's anybody else in the car, I stop and point out where she is interred. But, you know, it was a lot of very difficult work, drinking in bars where authors used to drink, eating at restaurants where authors used to eat, going to libraries and bookstores, just terribly fun, grueling work. So that was some of my favorite work involved with this. And in the book, there are a lot of features on locations that pop up over and over again. The Huntington, which I mentioned, is certainly one of them. They host the archives of a lot of authors, not just Octavia Butler, but Charles Bukowski as another major Los Angeles writer, a number of books or a number of authors from around the world. Hilary Mantel of Wolf Hall fame, her papers are at the Huntington. And I really love getting to share what makes some of these places special to me through the lens of the authors who spent time there or who wrote about it. There's something really fun to me, and I hope to those of you who are watching this, about going someplace that's been captured in fiction. I see questions. Oh man, I'm so excited. I mean, I have other things I can read as our time together progresses, but I think I'm gonna get to some questions and start talking about them. Okay. So, what is an underrated literary place in Los Angeles that book lovers must absolutely visit? Gosh, well, I mentioned the Huntington. It's one of my favorite places, not only for those archives, but to be able to go in to the library section and see a first folio by Shakespeare, and see handwritten manuscripts and see a Gutenberg Bible, see Audubon paintings of birds, and to be able to walk around and explore greenhouses. I love the Japanese garden. So the Huntington, but I also think it's a pretty well-known one. I also, I really love, as a legacy of the years that I worked downtown, when Angel's Flight is running. It's the world's shortest functioning railway, so it's not a very long trip. I'm trying to remember what the price is now. It's like $1 round trip, maybe. But there's something really fun about taking a tiny little funicular up a hillside, up Bunker Hill. But it's also got a really fun and storied literary legacy. I mean, you have Michael Connelly titling a book Angel's Flight, but Arturo Bandini in Ask the Dust lives alongside that same hill. The wealthy people who lived on Bunker Hill, rather than walk up the hill from Grand Central Market and the shops in that part of downtown, would take this little rail car. So it's an interesting function of the wealth that used to be in that part of LA. And it's just a fun relic of that. But the fact that it's been reactivated and is still functioning, it's a fun little trip when, you can go out and explore things that put you in very close quarters with other humans. So, hold on to that one for when that's free. Oh gosh. Okay. So then, do you have any favorite or funny interview stories that didn't make it into the book that I can share? Gosh, trying to think of what all didn't make it into the book. I will tell you my favorite interview story. They were all so fun. I tried to pick places that, for the most part, showed up in their work. So even like with Amy Bender, in The Particular Sadness of Lemon Cake, her main character ends up working at a French restaurant on Vermont in Los Feliz. And it was a fictional restaurant, but of course we met at a real French restaurant on Vermont in Los Feliz. But one of my favorites was when I interviewed Amber Benson in Echo Park. I had picked Valerie, the little bakery and cafe, for two reasons. One, I really like their baked goods. Two, it was on Echo Park Avenue where a lot of the action of the Witches of Echo Park take place. And while we're sitting there, Amber points out the apartment building across the street where she had lived and gathered a lot of the imagery and ideas that would become foundational to Witches of Echo Park. And I had no idea that Valerie was across the street from that building. And then she also told me that the house that's kind of at the center of the first book especially is based on a real house. And she and I ended up walking up Echo Park Avenue, up the hill. It's quite sunny, a little overdressed for it, but to be able to walk a long path in the same footsteps as these characters and see the house that was so central to the book. It was just a really fun, unexpected adventure where both of us were still free, and taking a little, 20-minute trek up the hill was totally doable and very fun. So that is probably my favorite interview story, but I loved them all. To be able to sit down with some of my favorite authors and get to talk to them about their work and their craft. I just had some amazing conversations, and getting to, share those with readers has been so fun and so great. Let's see. Okay, so next question. What are your favorite bookstores in Los Angeles? Where do I even start? Oh, man. Okay. One, I love them all. I love bookstores. It's my life. I don't even know how many bookstore t-shirts I've bought during quarantine. And how many books I've ordered from independent bookstores. But, obviously I spent 10 years at the Last Bookstore, and it still kind of feels like my baby. Skylight is my neighborhood bookstore. But I love the history of Romans. I love how long it's been in Pasadena, how much of its community it has taken on the flavor of. I'm very excited about the new wine bar, and I was really looking forward to my in-person event to be able to go there. But anytime I'm in Pasadena, I stop at Vroman's. If I'm going through West Hollywood, I go to Book Soup. When, if I go early to UCB, I go to Counterpoint. There's some incredible children's bookstores in LA. Once Upon a Time in Montrose. They're the oldest children's bookstore, or oldest still operating children's bookstore in the US. And they're great people. La Libraria in Mid Wilshire, it's a Spanish language children's bookstore, and the women who run it import their own books from all over Latin America and Spain to be able to bring in books that actually represent the culture of their readers and their families, so that it's not just books imported from Spain, which is a lot of Spanish language literature are translations from Spain versus Mexico versus Colombia. And so for Honduran kids in LA to be able to read Honduran stories, I think that work is really magical. And I also love the Ripped Bodice in Culver City. Anytime I'm in Culver, I stop there. They're the first all romance bookstore in America. And they do such great work advocating for romance literature. Oh, I love it. Romans is 125 this year. Jeez, I knew it was over 100 years old. That's incredible. And the fact that Romans has weathered the Depression, the downturn. I mean, they've been through a pandemic before. If anybody can survive this, it's got to be a bookstore that's already done that, right? LA is full of incredible bookstores, and I think it was certainly a factor in including bookstores specifically in this book, is that as somebody who used to be on the other side of things for a long time, publishers in New York, when they send authors to LA, are we booked them into one bookstore and that's enough for the tour. And people in LA are well, if you have an event in Pasadena, nobody from Santa Monica is going to go to that. I mean, maybe now when there's no traffic, but which reminds me, I'm and Pages in Manhattan Beach, seriously, all I have to do is think of a part of town, and I'm ooh, Assawan, which is one of the great Black-owned and focused bookstores in the U.S. I mean, there are 2-3 pages of bookstores in my book because each one is wonderful and special, and I love them all. And a follow-up, am I worried about bookstores closing due to the coronavirus? I think I think in some ways they're in less danger than like live performance venues, because bookstores can still do their work on a digital model, but it loses a lot of the importance of what bookstores do. Being able to browse, being able to feature a title that you've never heard of before, being able to have a bookseller hand sell you a book. That's a lot harder in the digital age. And, indie bookstores have always been amazing at figuring out new ways to do things and kind of pivot. So I have friends across the country who are, you can buy a bundle from them from a specific bookseller, and that bookseller will like send you 3 of their favorites, or they're setting up sort of digital versions of their shelves so that it's not just a search function, but you can look at their poetry section and maybe discover a title you've never heard of. So I think bookstores are being really innovative, but when consumer spending is down, that is really difficult for people who are reliant on retail sales. So as Romans mentioned, they're also they mentioned Libro.fm, which if you're not using it and you like audiobooks, I recommend you switch. This is very much my like independent bookseller itself. But with Libro.fm, you're not supporting Amazon, who owns Audible. And you can do a monthly subscription. You can choose a bookstore like Romans, who gets a portion of your monthly subscription. And with that subscription, like you get a credit and it goes toward any audiobook. I think, I pay like $15 a month, and I definitely bought like a $30 audiobook with one of those $15 credits yesterday. So there are lots of great options. I love finding the ways that people are getting creative. Like I mentioned, I bought a lot of t-shirts in this time. I'm like, from here on out, all bookstore t-shirts all the time. That's all I ever want to wear, because I love supporting my colleagues and friends. Okay, so next question. When I read LA-based literature, I find the vegetation/plants often play a role. Did you find that to be true? And if so, what plants came up most often? I love this question. I have not been asked this at all. This is amazing. I also love that I'm being asked that as I'm like surrounded by my own houseplants. I still remember when I was a kid, before I moved to LA, don't mind me as I like casually reach beyond my computer. I mentioned this because of what time of year it is, but Francesca Leah Block was my like big introduction to LA literature. Still one of my favorites. This is Girl Goddess No. 9's been out of print for a long time, but it's very dear to me. And in it, there was a character in one of the short stories. There's a character named Jacaranda, and I was like, "What is that? I know she's named for a plant, but like, what is it?" And then I looked it up, and then I moved to LA and realized that like of our actual weather seasons, Jacaranda season is one of the most distinct, and certainly my favorite. So I think Jacaranda shows up a lot. Obviously, oleander in Janet Fitch's White Oleander. But I think there's certainly something, maybe for even more so for people who aren't from here, about just how eternally green it is in Los Angeles. Like, in the late winter, leaves will turn green or turn brown, but even then, you almost never see a fully naked tree. Flowers bloom year round. There is something, especially if you were escaping from somewhere else, that's a little foreign in how verdant continually Los Angeles is. But yeah, I feel like jacarandas do come up a lot because that's such a distinctively Los Angeles tree. Palm trees for sure. It's kind of a classic stereotype of LA. But yeah, I mean, I can think of various images of characters describing lawns as they walk down streets, or I suppose you can tell from the light, but I'm like, there's a window right here. So I'm like looking out at the trees in my neighborhood. But I think there's something, especially when it comes to like wintertime, when you expect the world to turn gray and the plant life to be dead, and here it isn't. And I also think that some of the like vegetation and agriculture was a big selling point for Southern California. So it's, you know, I think about the like advertising images from post World War II when they were getting people to move out to Southern California, and it was all orange groves. And you look at what Hollywood used to look like, you know, almost every neighborhood in LA used to be a rancho. Like Beverly Hills was a farm. You know, I live in Los Feliz, which was named, it retained part of the name of the rancho that was here. And so this was, like most places, really heavily agricultural. And I think there's still some beauty and mystique to how constantly green it is here. So anyway, that's my roundabout answer about vegetation. I hope that was interesting. Okay, next question. Who is the most fascinating Angelino author you've come across in your research? I can't play favorites. Man, oh gosh. I feel like I should maybe pick somebody who's no longer with us, because it feels weird to pick somebody who's still alive. Gosh. Most fascinating. Well, you know, I mention her frequently, and she comes up obliquely in my book, but I'm fascinated by Sheila Graham, who is maybe best known, I think, by most people for being F. Scott Fitzgerald's girlfriend in his later years. Secretary/girlfriend. Was when Zelda was institutionalized and F. Scott Fitzgerald was out here drinking too much, eventually dying. But she wrote a book called College of One about Scott essentially educating her, giving her like a massive reading list. So, you know, to a point, she was kind of an autodidact. Like she got a really great education, but you know, with Scott's guidance, but mostly on her own. And then she also wrote the long out of print book about the Garden of Allah Hotel in West Hollywood, with which I have been obsessed for many years. So she's, you know, a not super well-known figure. I mean, her books were out of print for a long time. Melville House republished College of One with her Neversink library, but it was out of print for a long time. So she's, I think, based on the parameters I set for myself of an author you might not know much of or anything about, who ended up being really interesting and fascinating, I think she might be who I'd pick. But you know, there are just so many people with incredible stories, like Eileen Chang, who is not very well known in the US, I think in part because she continued to write in, I believe it was Mandarin. I don't think it was Cantonese. I think it was Mandarin. But she was exiled from China, but was a major author in China, moved to Los Angeles, but continued to write for a Chinese audience. And her works are available in translation. I think there was a big boost in interest in her when Lust Caution was made into a film, but she was just a fascinating woman who led a very interesting life in China that led to her being forced out of the country and living in exile for the rest of her life, and I think is underread and understudied in the US. So there are a few options. Oh, next question. Who is the author you think best depicts Los Angeles in their work? That's so tough. I say that because I think, I have a quote that I would like to start with. It's funny because I marked it not knowing I would be asked a question like this. Okay, this is from Susan Straight. To everyone from back home, LA was one big city. They didn't know LA was 1,000 little towns, entire worlds recreated in arroyos and strawberry fields and hillsides. So I always struggle with that question because there are so many facets to Los Angeles that I think it's hard to pick one author who addresses every element of that. We have there are 224 languages spoken in Los Angeles. We have huge immigrant communities. There's massive wealth disparity. And the city itself is so sprawling that what Sandra Singh Low writes about in Van Nuys is going to look totally different than what Dana Johnson writes about in downtown LA versus, Bukowski in his San Pedro years. So I'm trying to think of who kind of covers the most ground. And it's tough too, because, you look at different periods in time, like Chandler's Los Angeles, Kane's Los Angeles, they're, pretty different to what they are right now. They're Chester Himes was writing about a World War II era Los Angeles, but there's certainly certain themes and issues present in Iffy Holler's Let 'Em Go that are still relevant today. But I think I might, in this moment, and it might be a different answer later, I might pick Dana Johnson. Her novel, Elsewhere, California, really captures the differences between different pockets of Los Angeles. And then her short story collection, In the Not Quite Dark, is mostly about downtown LA. And it captures a lot of the continual change, but it's also, West Covina. And there's a really incredible short story at the end about Biddy Mason and Henry Huntington, who were contemporaries, but impacted the city in totally different ways. Biddy Mason was a slave who didn't realize she was free once she was brought to California, and eventually learned and became a major real estate owner. She founded an AME church. But you don't necessarily see massive, glorious museums and libraries built out of her estate. So that disparity and the way that we tell history. I also, I also want to shout out my friend Mike Sampson, Mike the poet, who has been writing about Los Angeles for all kinds of places. He writes a lot for KCET. He does a lot of live poetry. He teaches. And he writes about all of these different incredible pockets of Los Angeles. But yeah, I think one of the reasons I really wanted to do this book, and I think it's the same for Colleen as well, is that there's such a variety to the experience of Los Angeles that having a book that highlighted all of these different authors and different aspects of the city was really important, because there's no one narrative of Los Angeles. Let's see. Next question. I'd imagine that authors from different areas of the country tend to reflect their city-specific experiences and surroundings in some way in their writing. What themes do you see in LA-based writers' work that reflect the unique experience of living in LA? Whew. Man. Gosh. So I think there are a few themes that recur, especially depending on the era and the genre. One of the strongest literary traditions that comes out of Los Angeles is our noir. Certainly Chandler, Kane, but up to like Michael Connelly and Steph Cha. There's a big desire in literature to show that the dream that the country has been sold, and the world, honestly, at this point, of Los Angeles as a place of sunshine and palm trees and beautiful people and not a lot of clothing, strolling down, Venice Beach or the Strand, or, this very particular image, or, wealthy people in Beverly Hills or Bel Air. And the potency of noir here is to say, sure, you've been told it's all sunshine and orange trees and promises of suburbia or wealth. But underneath it all, there's still this like deep, dark undercurrent of murder and intrigue. And I think that juxtaposition has just fed so many LA authors for decades and decades. So I think that's a big, it's a genre, but I think that duality of, our almost oppressive sunshine and sort of continual summer and, promises of usefulness and beauty, and then to compare that with, people being horrible and terrible to each other. I think that's a really common recurrent theme. There's, and you can correct me in the chat if you'd like, Liska, I see that you're here. I don't remember if this was just in conversation that we had. I think so, versus in Catalina itself. But Liska Jacobs, another amazing LA writer, in talking about setting her novel Catalina in LA and on Catalina Island, she was talking about like westward expansion and this idea of like, moving west. And if you can't make it here, where else are you going to go? And really like reaching the end of that idea of go west, young man, and hitting like, that last stop, that island off the coast of Los Angeles, and there's nowhere else to go to find a new start, to find new opportunities. So I think there's an element there too of that promise of what you can accomplish, what you can get from LA. And, there's certainly authors who explore that in a positive way, but there are a lot of them who say like, they're counterbalancing the dream, not necessarily with death and mayhem, but, disappointment and disillusionment. So I think, I guess that juxtaposition between what people say Los Angeles is and what the lived experience of Los Angeles is, and the way that plays out across a variety of genres, is pretty recurrent. Okay, so next, is there a book that has helped you cope with social distancing and pass the time? Ooh, man, I couldn't read more than like a news article for the first 3 weeks, and I felt like I was losing my mind, because I'm so used to reading and I spend so much of my time reading, but now I'm back to reading a lot all the time. I have been reading a lot of beloved YA fantasy from my youth because I find it very comforting. But But I also have some new-ish releases. Hold on, I'm going to adjust so that I can point some out. There's a new Wanda Coleman collection that just came out from Black Sparrow. And I just got that. And I have Luis Rodriguez's new book that I picked up just before lockdown. I got that at the beginning of March. So it's also been really nice to read new things by people whose work I really enjoy and admire. It still feels like I'm spending time with people who I love and am familiar with, but also like, you know, trying something new. So I'm enjoying that a lot. Oh, next question. What do you think sets the publishers and agents, etc., in LA apart from other scenes? Ooh. You know, I think there's not the same sort of establishment here as there is in New York. You know, my experience of New York publishing is very much bookseller oriented. But you know, they've got these like historic publishing houses, and they pay massive rents, and they have huge payrolls, and they have all this money to spend on sort of tentpole books, and so then there's a different kind of pressure. But I think publishing in general is a pretty collegial industry, as is bookselling. But in LA, I feel like there are a lot of people who are taking chances, doing really interesting things. Yeah, and you know, I think that's true probably of everyone in publishing outside of New York, but you know, it's really nice to be in the Los Angeles publishing scene, and there's a lot of support within LA publishing for LA authors, but also really authors outside of the New York bubble, period. Okay, since I only have 10 minutes, let's see. Okay. Nathaniel West's life and work. Oh, he is a quintessential LA author, although he's definitely one of those LA authors who didn't really like LA. At least that's what comes through in Day of the Locust. I explore a bit of his Hollywood. I love the part of Hollywood that he lived in, like on Ivar. I mean, it's certainly changed since then with the building of the 101. But there's still these really beautiful apartment buildings, and it feels like a little bit caught out of time in that part of Hollywood. And there's a really great article in the LA Times probably 20 years ago that you can find of a guy who does like a big deep dive and had more space to do it than I did, but I also go some places he doesn't. Nathaniel West, brief overview. Let's see. What did I find out about LA's literary landscape that nobody else knows? I don't know that I know anything that nobody else knows. I mean, part of the goal of writing this book was sharing all the discoveries I made with as many people as possible. But so I will slightly invert this and tell you a story of LA lit things that I didn't know. I have a lot of Joan Didion stories, as perhaps do we all. But when I first moved to LA, I lived 2 blocks from Joan Didion's house, like the house that she writes about in the White Album, and like pretty well immortalized as her house. And it wasn't until like 3 years after I moved away that I realized I had walked by Joan Didion's house to and from my car multiple times a week, every week for like 2 years. So Joan Didion and I used to be neighbors, but you know, so separated by like 40 years. So that is the thing I discovered that I felt like I should have known earlier. My book does a fabulous job, including the LA Lit community, presses, festivals, libraries, writing workshops, etc. Can I talk a little about it? LA has such a fun literary scene. There are things happening all the time for whatever you want to do. And even in this time, you can't really hold us down. LA Times Festival of Books got postponed. Unfortunately, Pasadena Lit Fest was canceled for the year, and Romans is a big part of that. But, it's a city of readers. And I think a lot of the snobbishness from other major cities, I don't know, like maybe New York, is that we're shallow and maybe we don't read. And I'm like, do you not know that all the major decision makers in entertainment are constantly reading to be able to figure out properties that they can turn into features or TV shows? But beyond that, people read here. That's how we support so many bookstores as we have. And so the people who are here show up. I mean, LA Times Festival of Books is the biggest literary festival of its kind in the US. And there are all of these presses, like I said, doing really interesting and creative work. I mean, there's a ton of art book work in the city, zines. So you have Zine Fest, you have LA Art Book Fair, Printed Matter comes here. And so not only are people doing interesting things with content and text, but also with the form of the book as an object. Our libraries do incredible programming, have incredible resources. In addition to generally recommending Susan Orlean's The Library Book, if you go to Central Library, when it's possible to do that again, there is a new lab named after Octavia Butler. And Ray Bradbury and Octavia Butler both, and John Fonte, a number of these authors wrote about spending time at the library. Ray Bradbury mostly wrote on public typewriters at Central Library and at UCLA. So libraries have been a big support to the literary community, not only in carrying books and doing events, but also providing resources for writers to work. And then writing workshops. I mean, Beyond Baroque is the big one that's still really active. But the Women's Building for so long, you just have this community of people, and all of these MFA programs, all of these publications, just all of these ways to support and educate writers in LA. One of my favorite things to ask all of my interviewees was about their particular community of authors and readers in this city. And so, getting to hear how writers support and interact with each other, encourage each other, give each other feedback, show up for their readings, even digitally. Thank you. It's so much fun getting to see the way this city, for all its sprawl, and all its varied experiences, all of its 1,000 small towns. It's a city that loves to create and imagine and read. And I think all those things that make, music, film, television, etc., succeed here feed that same desire for creativity in writing. Let's see. And then last question, how is this book organized? It is intentionally kind of a randomized experience. There are classic author chapters, current author interview chapters, lists of books, authors, lots of pictures, maps, and it's designed in a way that you can kind of jump in and out, or if you read it straight through, it continues to be interesting and change pace the whole time. So thank you all so much for being here. Thanks for letting me talk to you from my socially distanced apartment. It was so wonderful to spend this time with you. Thank you.
And thank you so much, Katie, for speaking with us today. That was such a lovely talk. And thank you to all of you who tuned in this evening. We greatly appreciate all of your time and support of independent bookstores. You guys are the reason why we've been around for 125 years. So thank you. Please consider supporting our bookstore further by purchasing a copy of tonight's featured book, Read Me Los Angeles. You'll see the purchase button directly below the viewer screen. It's the green button, and it will take you to our website where you can finish your checkout process. Also, if you'd like to attend other virtual events through our Crowdcast channel, make sure to subscribe to our channel and to subscribe to our newsletter. That's the best way to get regular updates. And again, we are selling ebooks and audiobooks through Hummingbird and Libro FM. So if that is something that you guys are interested in, please check out the links. I posted them in the chat. And with that said, have a great evening, everyone. It was lovely having you all join us tonight. So thank you, Katie, again.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.